The battle to close to the west bank of the Rhine was not going well for Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The planned pincer move had been thwarted by German denial operations, which had caused flooding in the Ruhr Valley and prevented the US 9th Army from launching Operation Grenade, allowing the Germans to thin out their formations in the area to reinforce General Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, which was stubbornly slowing the advance of the 1st Canadian Army's Operation Veritable. Operation Veritable had failed to reach the Rhine at Wesel in about 4 days as planned, and now the battle was over 2 weeks old, less than halfway to Wesel, and opposed by Schlemm's army, reinforced by all the remaining German reserves in the west. 1st Canadian Army commanders were compelled to think again. The result was Operation Blockbuster. The new plan was the brainchild of General Simons, whose 2nd Canadian Corps would be strengthened by 3 divisions for the massive, armour-heavy assault towards Xanten and Wesel through the last line of the German West Wall, the Schlieffen position, or Hochwald-Laybach, as the Allies called it. Rather than attack astride the main road, Simons hoped to surprise the Germans by directing his main thrust through the narrow gap between the forests on the Hochwald feature, the last ridge of high ground before Wesel, using this railway, resurfaced by the engineers, as his main supply route. There were to be 4 phases in which, after the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions had cracked the enemy's forward defences, the Canadian 4th Armoured Division would launch a night attack to breach the Schlieffen position and push its armour through the Hochwald Gap, an overall distance of about 13 kilometres, which Simons hoped to cover in the first 24 hours. On the flanks, the British 43rd Wessex Division would clear the Rhine floodplain, and the British 11th Armoured Division would strike towards Sonsbeck. But whether the assault achieved surprise or not, it would be launched directly over the most difficult ground facing the 1st Canadian Army, where General Schlemm, correctly anticipating the area of the principal Allied effort, had deployed the best units of his 1st Parachute Army. For political reasons, General Horrocks' British 30 Corps had only been assigned a subsidiary role, even though it was in a position to outflank the formidable strongpoint by attacking over the relatively flat ground behind the now outflanked Siegfried Line. 30 Corps would attack 24 hours after the Canadians with 2 fresh divisions for its main thrust. The 3rd Infantry Division would break through the enemy's forward defences, then the Guards Armoured Division would pass through to drive on Wesel, while the 52nd Lowland and 53rd Welsh Divisions would push south, contact the Americans, then swing towards the Rhine. Expectations for the renewed offensive were high. In the Ruhr Valley, the flood levels had dropped sufficiently for Operation Grenade to be launched in the early hours of February the 23rd.
General Simpson's 9th Army GIs buckle on lifebelts as they get ready for the hazardous job of bridging the fast-flowing River Ruhr, the biggest natural obstacle barring the way to the Rhine. An unusually short and intense barrage, it lasted only 3/4 of an hour, swept the assault area with unprecedented thoroughness. The use of smoke is a feature of General Simpson's tactics in this operation. Artificial fog screens engineer squads and assault troops as effectively as the news blackout which descended over the first days of the offensive. Lorry-borne pontoons lumber like grounded barrage balloons to the water's edge. Bridging a river of this width, running a 4-knot current and within range of enemy guns is a tough assignment. Beneath the water, the enemy put stakes, wire, and floating mines.
Once across, the Americans, unlike the British and Canadians, pushed their armour forward with scant regard to its flanks. In 3 days, their bridgehead was already 32 kilometres wide by 16 deep and expanding rapidly. The 4 divisions of the German 15th Army, with no reserves remaining to reinforce them, faced imminent collapse. General Schlemm, faced with the prospect of an American breakout behind his army, quickly redeployed some of his formations opposing the British and Canadians, who already outnumbered his troops by 5 to 2, his armor by a staggering 8-to-1, and who completely dominated the skies. The German military cupboard was bare, and he was forbidden by Hitler to yield a centimeter of ground, let alone retire behind the Rhine. Schlemm's task was impossible. 0400 hours on the 26th of February, day 19 of the Rhineland battle. Operation Blockbuster was underway. Many tanks bogged. At least 40 were knocked out. But by midnight, the Canadians had advanced 7 kilometers, and with mopping up not yet completed, the Canadian 4th Armored Division struggled to assemble the units for the final phase, the assault through the Schlieffen position, which lay, dominated by the high ground of the Hochwald, in this broad, waterlogged valley. 2 lines of minefields, trenches, and knee-high wire entanglements. Once through all this, there still remained the steep, muddy climb to the top of the Hochwald feature, and the fight through the gap between the forests. With the valley cruelly exposed to enemy observation, it was vital to complete this phase in darkness, but the muddy ground delayed the arrival of the units until shortly before dawn on day 20. To ensure that some armor reached the gap in the appalling ground conditions, 2 thrusts were made. The 13 carriers and 11 tanks of the subsidiary thrust lost direction and were virtually annihilated in daylight by German anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts. By the time the main thrust had penetrated the Schlieffen defenses, it was full daylight, and intense mortar and artillery fire from 3 sides stopped it just short of the gap. Ammunition could not be moved forward or casualties evacuated, and the infantry, supported by 5 tanks that had managed to get forward, beat off no less than 7 determined counterattacks throughout the day. A fresh battalion renewed the advance at night and reached this road on the forward slopes near the exit from the gap, when it was stopped, pinned down by the ferocity of the German artillery, mortar and rocket fire. And frequent, savage counterattacks. White-hot fragments of metal rained down from tree-bursting shells to break up the attack of another battalion in the area of the railway, here at the bottom of the picture. And when an armored battle group, attacking from left to right, attempted to break through the gap in the afternoon of day 21, only 10 tanks managed to climb the muddy slopes to the start line, and 7 were quickly knocked out or disabled by 4 to 6 well-sighted guns commanding the exit from the gap. No further progress was made, and armored operations were temporarily suspended. Fire! Onto the Hochwald Gap and its approaches, Schlemm had ranged the firepower of the greatest concentration of guns, rockets, and mortars ever assembled by Germany in the West. The devastating bombardments continued day and night. Any respite only heralded savage counterattacks by his elite fire brigades of crack troops, supported by tanks and assault guns, to strike hard at the sorely pressed Canadian soldiers who for 4 days made repeated, courageous but futile attempts to break out of the gap. The price of Canadian glory in Canadian lives mounted ominously. In the forests flanking the gap, small groups of paratroopers, sometimes only a couple of men and a machine gun, all too often halted the troops of the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions. Others mounted violent counterattacks or infiltrated the Canadian positions. Underfoot, the forest floor had been thickly sown with anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. Elsewhere in the 2nd Canadian Corps sector, the British 11th Armoured Division, like the Canadians in the Gap, discovered its tanks could advance no faster than the infantry could clear the enemy from the high ground dominating its axis. Only the British 43rd Wessex Division met little opposition as it protected the left flank. But if the 2nd Canadian Corps' progress had become depressingly slow, further afield it was far more encouraging. On day 20, the German 15th Army had finally buckled under the pressure of the US 9th Army's armoured columns, which advanced almost unchecked, and forced Hitler, reluctantly, to allow Schlemm to make a limited withdrawal. Determined to hold on to the vital Hochwald feature at all costs, he moved his units facing 30 Corps to the remainder of the high ground in front of Wesel, to protect the only escape route for his encircled army, the vital bridges over the Rhine. There was no panic about the German withdrawal, which was carried out silently at night and was undetected by the Allies. Huge craters, anything up to 35 meters across, were blasted in roads. Trees and telegraph poles were felled. Mines were laid and bridges blown, all to create obstacles which, when covered by a couple of well-placed guns, slowed the Allied advance and created valuable time for the defenders. When Horrock's British 30 Corps had attacked, to start with, the British 3rd Division had some bitter and costly battles. But its advance soon quickened as the Germans withdrew, and the Guards' Armoured Division passed through on day 25. Troops of the 53rd Welsh Division had cautiously entered Weeze on day 23. The weather was foul, but the enemy had gone. The following day, they contacted the Americans here, posed for the obligatory historic photographs, and on day 25 turned towards the Rhine and Schlemm's new positions. Even with the now drastically reduced front, Schlemm was desperately short of manpower and had been compelled to withdraw his elite units from the Hochwald area on the night of day 24 to prepare a final defensive position in front of the Wesel bridges, for Hitler still forbade a general withdrawal across the Rhine. German troops were exhausted after nearly 3 weeks of continuous hard fighting. Any replacements were either elderly or youths in their teens. Yet, for all their superior resources, it was to take the Allies a further week's bitter fighting to eliminate a bridgehead that was now no deeper than 15 kilometers. While the US 16th Corps pushed up from the south, the British 43rd Wessex Division from the north and the Canadians, through the Hochwald Gap at last, moved on Xanten. The Canadian and British 3rd Infantry Divisions closed on Sonsbeck, and the Guards' Armoured and 53rd Welsh Divisions fought to clear the woods of the Bonninghart Ridge. And now there would be no help from the air, for intense German anti-aircraft fire in the bridgehead was causing unacceptable casualties, and close support air operations had to be called off. March the 8th, day 29 of the Rhineland conflict, and the final battles began at Ossenberg, Alpen, Veen, and Xanten. An attack on Xanten 2 days earlier had been thrown back. Now at 0500 hours, in darkness and driving rain, 3 battalions, supported by crocodile flamethrowers, advanced behind an intense artillery barrage to try again. Hitler had ordered troops of the 6th Parachute Division to fight to the last, and it took 4.5 hours of costly and gallant fighting to overcome resistance, then cross the anti-tank ditch, and a further 8 hours, the commitment of a 4th Battalion and more heavy casualties to flush the defenders from the ruins of the badly bombed town. For platoon commanders, some without radios, the problem was one of communications. In the noise and smoke, it was far from easy to maintain control of sections, and to direct the fire of supporting armor to dislodge the well-concealed defenders from the mass of rubble and craters.
Hello, BBC. This is Chester Wilmot speaking from Field Marshal Montgomery's headquarters. The German bridgehead west of the Rhine, opposite Basel, has been wiped out. Yesterday afternoon, 3 columns of Canadian, British and American troops reached the western end of the 2 bridges which the Germans had blown yesterday morning. The end was sudden and swift. On Friday evening, the Germans were still resisting strongly, holding a line across the neck of the bend on which Basel stands. But during the night, they evidently withdrew the bulk of their forces, and when Montgomery's troops attacked yesterday morning, they found little more than rearguard parties covering roadblocks.
For the 21st Army Group, the fight for the west bank of the Rhine was over. But instead of the 3 or 4 days originally planned, it had taken 31, and the cost in dead and wounded was high. So what went wrong, and what is there to learn? In 1982, a group of officers at the headquarters of the Northern Army Group made a detailed study of Operations Veritable and Blockbuster in the course of preparing a battlefield tour. Oberstleutnant Burkhard Frank of the 11th Panzer Grenadier Division and Major Peter Knox of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers were members of that group. Going back to the beginning of the battle, were they able to come to any conclusions concerning the soundness of the planning for Operation Veritable?
We did come to a number of conclusions, and one of them was perhaps the lack of manoeuvre that Horrocks gave himself. Now, he said after the battle, "My attack was to take place between the Maas and the Rhine. There was, therefore, no room for manoeuvre and no scope for cleverness." Now, I think that by choosing to attack with 5 divisions up, which in effect meant that at best only 1 brigade was leading, with perhaps 2 assaulting battalions, it meant when opposition or obstacles were encountered, they had to be overcome not by a flanking manoeuvre, but by frontal assault. Perhaps I would also criticise his choice of his reserve divisions. His leading reserve division was 43 Wessex Division, an infantry division, and his follow-up reserve division was the Guards Armoured, which was a heavy armoured division, trained and practised primarily in breaching operations such as this, and not trained for rapid exploitation, as was the 7th Armoured Division, which at that time was still under command of 2nd British Army.
Well, that is true, but from a German point of view, this plan had every chance for a quick success, because first, it could and did achieve surprise. Second, it succeeded in gathering a very favorable force ratio for the British. And third, it hit the German front at its weakest point. The only criticism I have, according to the plan, is that it depended very much on hard frozen ground, whereas in this part of Germany and in this part of the year, frozen ground is rather the exception than the rule.
So, the Germans were surprised by an overwhelmingly superior force striking at their weakest sector. But the assessment of the likely weather and ground conditions was unrealistic. Divisions were allowed virtually no room for tactical manoeuvre, and the choice and commitment of 30 Corps reserve formations was questionable. When Operation Veritable failed to achieve its objectives, did the planning for Operation Blockbuster show any improvement?
We felt that 2nd Canadian Corps' attack against the Hochwald was very much a repetition of 30th Corps' attack against the Reichswald, with the main effort against a very narrow strip of tank-going terrain and otherwise attack into the woods. The major difference possibly that this time the attack was conducted against the point of main German strength and not against the German weakest point. I think that the Canadians did also the mistake that they repeated their attacks on the narrow Hochwald gap several times after it had been beaten off by the Germans, instead of moving the point of main effort or of reassuming the attack on a broader front.
But I think we agreed that the General Crerar, the Canadian Army commander, was under great pressure from his Canadian subordinates to allow them a greater share of the battle honours. I think this was an instance when he should have resisted that national pressure. he must have known the good progress being made by the Americans in the south, and also the progress being made by his own 30 British Corps as they pushed south to effect the link-up with the US 9th Army.
Exactly. This was, I think, the right point for 1st Canadian Army to shift the effort back to 30th British Corps, to launch an attack into the rear of the German divisions still defending at the Mars line, to cut them off, to disrupt the German defense, and then to thrust towards Wesel Bridge, thus ending the whole campaign.
The use of airborne or special services units behind the enemy front was not included in either of the plans. Turning to the implementation of the plans, what were the study group's main conclusions about the conduct of the operations?
Well, it is easy to criticise with hindsight, but there certainly were a number of missed opportunities. The first, I think, was the delay by the 15th Scottish Division whilst they waited for the set-piece breaching brigade to come up and breach the Siegfried line, where the previous evening a patrol had crossed the line and found a village deserted of enemy, and a battalion had crossed the road bridge and made some considerable progress. Instead of acting on this information, the division seemed quite content to wait for the planned set-piece operation to cross the line as planned.
Similarly, you could say that 53rd Division missed their opportunity when they had seized their objectives at the eastern part of the Reichswald and were waiting. I think it's the duty of any commander, once he has reached his intermediate objective, to continue the attack even if he has no orders of his superior, and to keep in contact with the enemy or to assist his flank formations. The same was true for 15th Division, which had similar problems on the Materborn feature. I think they also choose the wrong area for vital ground because in this case, the exits from the Materborn should have been their vital ground, whereas the access to the Materborn would have been the vital ground for the Germans.
After the war, Horrocks did admit that the timing of the injection of 43 Wessex was his greatest mistake of the war, and I think we can't disagree with that. At the time he committed them, 15th Scottish Division had, although they had been in action for 2 days, were not exhausted and had not received the number of casualties that they expected, and they could probably have used their own reserve to continue the advance, where instead Horrocks committed his reserve, his core reserve, on a already congested axis. This only served to provide more delay and gave the Germans yet more time to bring up their reserves.
Speed was essential for Operation Veritable's success, so perhaps 30 Corps ought to have set more ambitious objectives. When events overtook the original plan, a more flexible and opportunist approach by formation commanders might have produced better results. And although General Horrocks' premature commitment of his Corps reserve caused a virtual 48-hour standstill, it was only one of many factors influencing the slowness of Operation Veritable's advance. Intense artillery and aerial bombardments created obstacles that hampered movement and aided the defenders.
This campaign was one of the rare occasions in war history that an army suffered from too much equipment, I think. These large British tank columns inevitably churned up the soft clay ground and got stuck, causing the infantry to wait, and thus it occurred that infantry was delayed by armor, which is especially a sad thing to tell for an armor officer like me. In addition, there was virtually no chance for rapid exploitation by armored units, even if British units could have done that.
An example of that must be the failure of the 43rd Wessex Division to continue the exploitation when they had broken through 15 Panzer Grenadier to a depth of 4.5 kilometres and actually got across the Goch-Kaukau road. They made no attempt to continue the exploitation further south. But I think if you criticise the British use of armour, I think you must agree that the special to task armour of 79th Armoured Division was used very well, and without that armour, such operations as the Canadian amphibious operations in the north would not have been possible without the use of the Buffaloes. And although the other armour, the flails and flamethrowers, had the same movement problems, there's no doubt that when they were used to good effect. And certainly we in NATO today would welcome the reintroduction of some of those equipments, and in particular a mechanical means of breaching minefields.
Yes, this is certainly one of the lessons of this battle that infantry with the support of armor is stronger than infantry without, even in heavily wooded terrain or built-up areas. And I must add that the Germans especially feared the crocodile. This was the one British weapon which always succeeded. However, I must really state that the British use of armor lacked a bit the element of surprise. These attacks were a bit stereotyped, though normally successful, and hence they were predictable, allowing the defender always to bring up fresh reserves and to prevent a British breakthrough.
The fact that the Germans managed to maintain a cohesive front was a considerable achievement, especially in light of the condition of their army at that time.
Most German divisions had been destroyed once or even twice during the retreat in France or during the subsequent German counterattack in the Ardennes, and they had to be reformed in the subsequent months. On the other hand, the situation in Germany was such that Germany had lost already 7.5 million soldiers in the army alone up to then, and was losing another 500,000 per month. The consequence of this was that the newly formed infantry divisions were poorly equipped and were poorly trained. And these infantry soldiers really just did what they were told to do, but not much more. This was different with the para divisions, which consisted of volunteers from Air Force units, with little experience as infantry as well, but with a good fighting spirit. A precondition for their commitment in this area was, however, the evacuation of the civilians from that area. And this evacuation had started 3 months earlier already. This allowed the German side, for instance, to prepare these widespread denial operations, among which the flooding of the Rhine Valley and of the Ruhr Valley were the most prominent, which may have been worth an additional 2 or even 3 divisions for the German side. It also allowed the Germans to make full use of the houses and villages and towns, which is necessary for any defender, I think. Let me add another point which came out and turned out of value for the German side in this stage of the battle. This was that you had to rely on a reserve for quick counterattacks or for blocking operations, and that the minimum strength of this reserve would be about 1 battalion per division.
Certainly the whole team were most impressed by the skillful use made by the Germans of their limited reserves, but I don't think they can escape criticism, because at times they tended to counterattack before they had been able to formulate good plans. For instance, the attack by 47 Panzer Corps south of Cleve was carried out before most of their armour and artillery had arrived, and consequently it was ill-prepared and failed when it came up against much stronger British opposition.
Yes, this is certainly true. All these large-scale counterattacks, either by 47 Panzer Corps or by Panzerlehr, were hastily planned and were executed with too little and too late.
If German counterattack philosophy was wasteful, and easily detected defences of the Siegfried Line type proved unsatisfactory, skillful use of the terrain for the sighting of well-concealed, mutually supporting defensive positions was not. The German command system speeded reaction time, for divisional chiefs of staff were decision-makers in their own right, which was invaluable when generals were out of touch with their headquarters. Most remarkable of all, perhaps, was the way German morale remained unbroken, particularly in the parachute divisions, at a time when all might have seemed lost. The 21st Army Group and the 1st Canadian Army's senior commanders saw the battle for the Rhineland as a success, claiming that since the 1st Parachute Army had been defeated west of the Rhine, opposition would be negligible when they eventually crossed the river. Operations Veritable and Blockbuster cost 15,600 British and Canadian lives. The Germans lost some 22,000 killed or seriously wounded and a similar number of prisoners. They lost a further 16,000 casualties and 30,000 captured in Operation Grenade, which cost the Americans about 7,300 casualties. But Schlem's 1st Parachute Army, against overwhelming odds, had slowed the 1st Canadian Army's advance to an average of 2 kilometers a day for 31 days, and made an orderly withdrawal across the Rhine. It was far from being a minor achievement.